10:30, 11, so take, don't have time. And at the time, they were working on a book called The Last Human, which was still in development with the publishers and the producers. And the goal of that was to reconstruct 22 different fossil humans and photograph them in environments and write things about them. And so he decided to test me out, took me under his wing. He saw that, I kind of knew some things and had been reading about this material for a while. He just took me through the whole process, sat me down. I spent probably about 1 month just applying like 5 muscles and then taking them off and reworking them and recalibrating tissue depths. And there was funky material in jars that we would look at and measure, and pieces of face and stuff like that, which was, to me, it was really cool. But, chimpanzees and gorillas and any kind of anatomy that we had available, we were studying. And ultimately, it just built up into a point where we realized financially, we weren't going to be able to do this, and time-wise, we might still be working on all these things. But so I started to photograph the heads that we were working on, and started to mess around in Photoshop. So I got some funny early things to show you that were just, more or less rather unsuccessful pieces. But they are what they are. Let's see. This was like Lucy, just kind of throwing them into environments, but more or less just coming up with using whatever I had myself, and lighting fires in the basement. Pretty stupid, but trying to do whatever I could to pull together an image that wasn't reading as an illustration, and the idea was to create wildlife photography of early humans. And so the actual, so this is one of the first reconstructions I had done, and this is actually appears at AM&H. So you can go to the Museum of Natural History and see this fellow on display and all his bits. But basically, that's the original skull. It's found in the cave at Cima de los Huesos in Atapuerca, Spain. And then basically it comes down to filling in whatever gaps there are, using sort of the left and right sections to mirror anything that's missing. And then referring to other fossils that may have those bits intact, and then applying the muscles, going through the stages, skin, and you can see the variation in musculature. Truthfully, I would go out on a limb and say that, your most accurate point in this is the muscular stage, because muscle tissue all across the globe have pretty much various thickness and size, and you can see on the skull where it begins and ends. But once you start to get into the skin, that becomes a bit more subjective. That's the finished casting, and then that's the finished piece. We call this guy Jesus, so for whatever reason, but it just turned out to be Jesus. And so this was one of the first pieces, and then working on this, I started to get the idea. Well, okay, I can photograph one head and photograph another head from 2 different species, and try to make a Photoshop thing of anything that we don't have or we don't have time to do. But always kind of putting the skull in the background. For example, I don't think I have it in PowerPoint. But so right here, this is a buddy of mine. Actually, if you go to the museum, you'll see my friend on one of the plaques, and my father's in there too as a Cro-Magnon. So that was pretty cool. But basically taking the reconstruction of the skull and only taking it to that point, and layering it in Photoshop, and then morphing and pushing pieces to create an image, and to create a pretty sound, close enough representation. Thinking about all the things that I mentioned before to kind of put that final face on it. And so this is the final result of that. And I've had a lot of anthropologists look at it. They seem to like it, so I go with it. And then but as time kind of went on, my work got noticed. The book, The Last Human, sold really well, and so it became like a really great calling card. And then one day, I may have heard of her, the Leakey Foundation was out in Africa with this producer from Nova, and she handed them my book, and the Nova people got in touch with whoever else, and ended up going into this weird cycle, and I got a call from Dallas, and they needed some reconstruction stuff done. And then ultimately there's another, that Becoming Human show came from that. But so they asked me to create a face for Lucy. She's a 3.2 million year old ape or hominid. But she's more or less an ape. I mean, there's a very gray line as to when apes and hominids and humans start to become something different. But if we go by a certain criteria of like brain size and diet and where they're living and how they're living and whatever, we come to the conclusion, at least me personally, that Lucy was still maybe the last ape in the chain of human greatness, that it was sort of that hallmark. She was an ape that walked upright, that had a body similar to a human, but there was still very apish features. She was still a very good climber, but her legs, if you want to imagine like a bonobo or a chimpanzee thorax, more or less, on a human pelvis and human legs, proportionally a bit different, but more or less, still an ape. And so this is the final piece I generated. Basically created the sculpture, photographed it, and then through the Last Human project, I was photographing chimps, gorillas, whatever I could, finding things online, whatever, just to get like a piece of wrinkle or some skin texture, and then applying that over the static photo to create a finished image. The idea was here to not create things that look straight like illustrations, but more like photography of an early human. So that really pushed me and forced me to want to think about this stuff in much more natural terms, and using sort of rough weather, kind of slight expressions. A lot of these earlier stuff and a lot of things you see, people ask, well, why not too much expression? Because early on, I really wanted to just focus on what this thing looked like without distortion of a grimace or smile or yelling. But there's some in there that do have sort of a greater range of that. And so these are just the drawings and sketches for her. And there's the underlying anatomy used to create her. So that's Lucy. And then that face ended up becoming a part of this mural that has been traveling with the actual skeleton of Lucy. She was in Times Square back in 2009. So this is the rough sketch of the mural, and I'll just show you it in all its glory. So there's a lot of phases to that. That was the pencil sketch. This is the tone study for it, the color study, the initial texture phase of trying to work in photography over the color study. Then we went out to, me and my buddy went out to South Dakota, Puerto Rico, and Wyoming to photograph landscapes and materials. It's just really expensive to get to. But we did our research as to why we picked those locations, because we found a lot of parallels between the deterioration of the landscape, the geography, and even a lot of flora in Puerto Rico have a very similar origin to things in Ethiopia. So the continents used to be together, all that stuff happened, but more or less, these places serve to be very well, and so far no botanists have come to me and said, we should not be there, and so so once we came back, I did a final drawing of the mural, and you can sort of see what's going on through here. And basically, this just tells a story of 7 million years of hominid and human occupation in Ethiopian fossil record, and kind of ending, with us in a tent looking back at time. And the landscape actually is just sort of like maybe 300 or 400 yard area of land that is changing over time. So in the final piece, this is the final image. We can see that this sort of forested woodland had, once the humidity and everything after 5-6 million years ago in Ethiopia went up, these very dense jungles encroached, and so you had hominids that were already moving through the trees, but when they hit the ground, they were walking. And there's a lot of argument as to how development of walking came about. And we've talked about this at length at the museum, and it seems to be more sound that walking was already in place. The anatomy for the human foot, in close respects, the way it looks now, wasn't like a chimpanzee foot. And there's this fossil out that they discovered a little while ago called Ardipithecus that has very chimp-like feet, but it's only about 400,000 years old. Not even. Artie's about 4.2 and Lucy's at like 3.9. So you have only about a window of, about 400,000 years for a very major mechanical and biological shift to occur. So with that, because Lucy's foot is human, it's a normal human foot. The great toe kind of slightly is off and divergent, but it's still a foot. If people, we climb really well. And we don't need a grasping toe to do that. You just need a sense of balance, and it helps if the toe might be angled a little bit, but I don't want to get too far into it. But more or less, the ultimate definitive proof would be finding a foot, like a human's foot that predates Ardipithecus, or is at the same time. And the idea is that foot was in place so that when they hit the ground, they really hit it running. And so there wasn't really much of a need for that piece of anatomy to have to go through those changes. What we speculate in Ardipithecus is that it's actually may be a chimpanzee ancestor. But the problem in this field is that usually when you find something that looks humanish and apish, it's automatically said this is a human ancestor. But that may not be the case. And if you have a much more open mind about how you're approaching it, you're not going to set a goal for yourself to prove. You're going to just let the evidence carry you to that way of thinking or that theory. And so it seems more that Ardipithecus and things like that may be leading into chimpanzees, because at that time, that's around the time that there's a divergence in the fossil record from apes and humans. Yes.
So what's Lucy?
Lucy's an ape, and she's a pre-human, pre-hominid. But there's certain, just because she has a foot shaped like whatever and anything else, she's still showing evidence of behavior just like an ape, living in larger group communities, living in different niches, but not a jungle dweller. Being able to capitalize on the savanna, and it's her offspring and her descendants that become the first true hominids. Things like Australopithecus africanus, Homo habilis, Homo georgicus, and these guys even fall into a gray area because, I'm not convinced that, they have to be early Homo or late Australopithecus. There may very well should be a third genus right in between that could very well describe these sort of gray area hominids. But so, I got some details of, and again, this was done this is pre-ZBrush, so this is all Photoshop stuff, and based off, we photographed literally and I'm not even kidding, 15